Lieutenant Commander Zektar stood on the bridge of the Valerian warship watching the damaged human vessel drift through space. The reptilian officer had seen many broken ships in his 20 years of service, but this one looked different. The hull was torn open in dozens of places and burn marks covered most of the surface. Any other species would have abandoned such a wreck long ago. Yet the humans were still inside fighting to keep their ship alive. The distress signal had reached the Valerian patrol fleet 3 hours earlier. Admiral Thexor had ordered an immediate response because the message mentioned the Korath swarm. The swarm was a threat that every civilized species feared. The bioships could adapt to any weapon and grew stronger with each battle. Most races simply ran when the swarm appeared. Zektar had studied the files on humanity during the approach. They were a young species that had only discovered faster-than-light travel 50 years ago. Their technology was basic compared to most galactic civilizations. Their military tactics seemed chaotic and inefficient. The logical conclusion was that they would be easy to rescue and quick to accept Valerian protection. The first sign that something was wrong came when the human captain responded to their offer of help. Captain Jake Morrison appeared on the communication screen with blood running down his face from a head wound. Behind him, Zektar could see smoke and sparks from damaged equipment. The human was calm despite the obvious danger. Morrison explained that his ship, the USS Defiance, had been fighting the Korath swarm for 3 months. They had started with 96 crew members. Only 47 were still alive. The ship's weapons were nearly destroyed and life support was failing. Any rational being would have surrendered or fled long ago. Instead, Morrison asked if the Valerians wanted to help them kill more swarm ships. Admiral Thexor was confused by this response. He explained that the Valerian fleet would provide repairs and safe escort out of the combat zone. The humans could share their tactical data about the swarm in exchange for protection. It was a fair trade that would benefit both species. Morrison listened to the offer and nodded slowly. Then he asked why the Valerians had not simply destroyed the swarm themselves if they were so advanced. The question made Admiral Thexor uncomfortable, because the answer was obvious. The Korath swarm was too dangerous to fight directly. Every military computer simulation showed that engaging the swarm resulted in total fleet destruction. The human captain seemed amused by this logic. He said that computers were useful tools, but they could not calculate everything. Some problems required solutions that made no sense on paper. The swarm could be beaten, but only if someone was willing to try impossible things. Zektar was assigned as liaison officer to the human ship during repairs. He had studied alien psychology and was considered an expert on first contact situations. His job was to observe the humans and determine how useful they might be as allies. The initial assessment was not promising. The human crew displayed multiple signs of psychological instability. They made jokes about death and injury as if violence was entertaining. They took unnecessary risks to recover the bodies of dead crew members, even when it endangered the living. They continued working despite injuries that should have required immediate medical attention. Sergeant Lisa Chen was the worst example of human irrationality. She was the demolitions expert responsible for maintaining the ship's weapons. Zektar found her in the ammunition storage room 3 hours after a massive explosion had nearly killed her. Chen was covered in burns and had a piece of metal sticking out of her left arm. She was still loading torpedo warheads and humming a cheerful song. When Zektar suggested that she should report to the medical bay, Chen laughed. She explained that the medical officer was busy with more serious cases. Her injuries were not life-threatening, so she could wait. More importantly, the ship needed working weapons more than she needed immediate treatment. The logic was sound, but the casual acceptance of pain was disturbing. Zektar asked Chen about her experience fighting the Korath swarm. She described battles where human survival odds were less than 10%. The humans had developed tactics that required crew members to sacrifice themselves to achieve victory. Chen spoke about these suicide missions as if they were routine maintenance tasks. The most unsettling conversation happened when Zektar asked why the humans continued fighting against impossible odds. Any logical species would have retreated after losing half their personnel. The smart choice was to preserve the survivors and find a safer battle to fight. Chen stopped working and looked at Zektar with an expression he could not interpret. She explained that running away was not always an option. Sometimes you had to stand and fight even when victory seemed impossible. The Korath swarm would not stop hunting just because humans retreated. They would follow and kill more people until someone made them stop. But the real reason was simpler than tactical necessity. Chen said that humans had learned something important during their violent history. Fear was not something to be avoided or overcome. Fear was a tool that could make you stronger if you knew how to use it properly. The trick was to let fear sharpen your thinking instead of clouding it. Other species tried to eliminate fear through training and discipline. Humans fed their fear and turned it into something useful. They became more creative when they were terrified. They found solutions that calm minds could never imagine. Fear kept them alive in situations where logic demanded death. Zektar spent the next 2 days observing human behavior patterns. The crew worked with an efficiency that seemed impossible given their emotional state. They modified weapon systems using spare parts that should not have been compatible. They repaired hull breaches with materials that were never designed for structural support. They treated their damaged ship like a living thing that could be convinced to keep fighting through willpower alone. Engineer Ben Parker showed Zektar how human engineering differed from Valerian methods. Valerians built systems with multiple backup layers to prevent failure. Humans built systems that were designed to fail safely and keep working anyway. They expected everything to break eventually, so they prepared for creative solutions when normal methods stopped working. The philosophy extended beyond technology into military strategy. Human battle plans assumed that everything would go wrong at the worst possible moment. They prepared backup plans for their backup plans. More importantly, they trained their personnel to improvise when all planning failed. Chaos was not something to be prevented, but something to be managed and directed. As repairs neared completion, Zektar realized that his initial assessment had been completely wrong. The humans were not primitive or inefficient. They were operating under a completely different set of assumptions about how the universe worked. They had built their entire civilization around the idea that survival required embracing uncertainty rather than controlling it. The revelation was disturbing because it implied that human success was not accidental. They had developed these seemingly chaotic methods because those methods worked better than logical alternatives. If that was true, then everything Zektar thought he knew about warfare might be incomplete. The final proof came when long-range sensors detected an approaching Korath fleet. The swarm had found them and would arrive in 12 hours. Admiral Thexor immediately ordered a retreat to preserve the Valerian ships. Captain Morrison volunteered to stay behind and buy time for the evacuation. Zektar watched Morrison make this decision without consulting tactical computers or analyzing probability matrices. The human captain simply looked at the situation and decided that someone had to slow down the swarm. The math was irrelevant because the choice was not really about numbers. For the first time since meeting the humans, Zektar felt genuine fear. Not fear of the approaching enemy, but fear of what he might learn about warfare if he stayed to watch the battle. Some knowledge was too dangerous for a rational mind to handle safely. The alert sirens woke Zektar from restless sleep aboard the human vessel. He had been dreaming about creatures made of living metal that could think and adapt faster than any computer. The dream felt more like a memory than imagination. 3 days of watching humans work had changed something fundamental in how he understood reality. Captain Morrison was already on the bridge when Zektar arrived. The human looked like he had not slept at all. His uniform was stained with grease and his hands were covered in small cuts from working on damaged equipment, but his eyes were sharp and focused in a way that reminded Zektar of predators hunting prey. The tactical display showed what every military computer had calculated would eventually happen. The Korath swarm had found them and was approaching, fast. The bioships moved in perfect formation like a living organism with thousands of parts. Each vessel was the size of a city and armed with weapons that could adapt to any defense. The swarm had been growing stronger for centuries by absorbing the technology of every species it defeated. Admiral Thexor appeared on the communication screen, looking grim but determined. The Valerian commander had made his decision based on pure mathematical logic. The combined human and Valerian forces could not defeat a swarm fleet of this size. Retreat was the only rational option. The research station in the system would have to be abandoned to save the warships. Morrison listened to the evacuation plan without interrupting. Zektar expected the human to agree immediately. No sane being would choose to fight impossible odds when retreat was available. The research station contained 3,000 civilians, but sacrificing them to preserve military assets was standard. Tactical doctrine. Dead civilians could not fight future battles. Instead, Morrison asked how long the evacuation would take. Admiral Thexor explained that moving 3,000 people required 16 hours minimum. The swarm would arrive in Nizindur 12 hours. Simple mathematics showed that some civilians would have to be left behind. It was an unfortunate necessity, but unavoidable given the tactical situation. Morrison nodded thoughtfully and asked if anyone had calculated how many civilians could be saved if the swarm was delayed for 4 additional hours. The question made no sense because nothing could delay the Korath swarm once it achieved momentum. Every historical record showed that bioships were unstoppable in direct combat. The human captain seemed unbothered by historical precedent. He explained that the USS Defiance and its crew could provide the necessary delay. The ship was already damaged beyond full repair, and most of the crew were wounded. They had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. 4 hours seemed like a reasonable challenge. Admiral Thexor tried to explain why this plan was impossible. The tactical computers showed less than a 5% chance of holding the swarm for even 1 hour. The Defiance was outnumbered 300 to 1. The bioships could adapt to human weapons within minutes of first contact. Mathematical logic demanded immediate retreat. Morrison smiled at these objections, as if the admiral had told an amusing joke. He said that computers were excellent at calculating normal situations, but they could not account for human creativity. The swarm had never faced an enemy that treated mathematics as a suggestion rather than a law. This would be an educational experience for both sides. Zektar found himself assigned to remain aboard the Defiance as a military observer. His orders were to record human tactics for future analysis, assuming anyone survived to read the reports. He protested that staying behind served no logical purpose since the ship was obviously doomed. Morrison agreed that logic suggested certain death, but pointed out that logical thinking had never solved impossible problems. The preparation for battle revealed more disturbing aspects of human psychology. The crew displayed what could only be described as enthusiasm for their approaching destruction. They made bets on how long they could survive and joked about creative ways to damage the bioships. Engineer Parker composed farewell messages to his family while simultaneously building weapons from spare parts. Sergeant Chen spent her time rigging explosive charges throughout the ship. Zektar assumed this was a defensive measure until he realized the charges were designed to destroy the Defiance itself. Chen explained that human ships often became weapons of last resort when conventional fighting failed. A properly timed self-destruction could eliminate multiple enemy vessels if positioned correctly. The casual acceptance of suicide as a tactical option horrified Zektar. Valerians understood sacrifice when necessary, but humans seemed to embrace death as a creative opportunity. They had turned their own mortality into another tool for achieving victory. The logic was sound, but the psychological implications were terrifying. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez handled navigation and tactical planning with mechanical precision, despite obvious signs of extreme stress. Her hands shook constantly and she jumped at unexpected sounds. But her voice remained steady when she explained the battle plan to Zektar. Fear was making her more focused rather than less effective. Rodriguez described how humans had learned to use fear as a performance enhancer during their violent evolutionary history. Other species developed logical thinking to overcome emotional responses. Humans had discovered that emotion could improve logical thinking if properly channeled. Fear sharpened reflexes and expanded creative problem-solving abilities. The key was accepting fear rather than fighting it. Rodriguez explained that trying to eliminate fear was like trying to eliminate hunger or pain. These emotions existed for survival reasons, and removing them created dangerous blind spots. Humans had learned to feel afraid while still thinking clearly. It was a skill that required constant practice, and could not be taught through normal training methods. As the swarm approached, Zektar observed the human crew making final preparations with growing amazement. They displayed none of the panic or despair that he expected from soldiers facing certain death. Instead, they worked with calm efficiency punctuated by occasional laughter and casual conversation. It was as if they were preparing for routine, patrol duty rather than suicide mission. The most disturbing moment came when Morrison gathered the crew for what humans called a briefing. The captain explained exactly how bad their situation was using precise mathematical calculations. The swarm outnumbered them by overwhelming margins, their weapons were inadequate, and their ship was already half destroyed. Victory in any conventional sense was mathematically impossible. Then Morrison smiled and asked if anyone had suggestions for unconventional approaches. The crew responded with dozens of ideas that ranged from creative to completely insane. They discussed ramming bioships at maximum speed and detonating antimatter charges inside enemy vessels. They planned to use their own destruction as a tactical advantage by timing explosions for maximum psychological impact on the swarm. Zektar realized that humans did not simply accept impossible odds. They actively sought out impossible situations, because those circumstances required the kind of creative thinking that humans excelled at producing. Normal tactical problems could be solved by any species with adequate technology. Impossible problems required uniquely human approaches to warfare. The final revelation came when Morrison asked Zektar if he wanted to transfer to a Valyrian ship before the battle began. The offer was genuine, and Morrison would not consider it cowardice if Zektar chose safety over observation duty. But the human captain seemed curious about whether other species could learn to think like humans when survival depended on abandoning logic. Zektar found himself unable to answer immediately. His training demanded that he preserve himself to report his observations to Valyrian command. But something about human determination was infectious in ways that troubled him deeply. The crew was not simply resigned to death. They were excited about the challenge of turning certain defeat into unexpected victory. The Korath swarm appeared on long-range sensors exactly when predicted. The bioships moved with perfect coordination toward the research station like a living tide of destruction. They had defeated every enemy they had ever encountered using the same relentless advanced tactics. Mathematics and history both confirmed that nothing could stop them. Morrison looked at the tactical display and nodded with satisfaction. He ordered the Defiance to move toward the swarm at maximum speed while every other ship in the system retreated to safe distance. The human vessel looked pitifully small compared to the bioships, but it accelerated toward them without hesitation. As they approached the enemy fleet, Zektar felt his understanding of warfare beginning to collapse. Everything he had learned about military strategy assumed that survival was the primary objective of any engagement. Humans had built their entire tactical doctrine around the opposite assumption. They fought as if victory was more important than living to see the results. The revelation was terrifying because it suggested that human military success was not accidental or temporary. They had developed these methods because conventional warfare could not solve the problems they faced during their violent history. If humans could defeat impossible odds through sheer determination, then every other species had been thinking about conflict in fundamentally flawed ways. Rodriguez announced that they had reached weapons range of the leading bioships. The first Korath bioship died in a way that Zektar had never seen before. The massive living vessel simply stopped moving and began to dissolve from the inside out. Its organic hull bubbled and melted while the creature screamed through frequencies that made every being within range feel sick to their core. The death took almost 3 minutes, and the sound echoed through space like a warning to every other species in the galaxy. Sergeant Chen had caused this destruction by flying a small shuttle directly into the bioship's feeding port. She carried enough antimatter explosives to level a city, but that was not what killed the creature. Chen had studied the internal anatomy of captured swarm vessels during the 3-month conflict. She knew exactly where to place charges for maximum psychological impact rather than simple damage. The bioship died in agony because Chen wanted the other creatures to watch and understand what humans were willing to do to win battles. This was not efficient killing designed to eliminate enemies quickly. This was calculated torture designed to create fear in beings that had never experienced doubt about their own superiority. Captain Morrison watched the destruction with calm satisfaction while ordering the Defiance deeper into the swarm formation. The human crew responded to Chen's death not with grief, but with increased aggression. They cheered when her shuttle exploded, and immediately began planning similar attacks against other bioships. The loss of their comrade had made them more dangerous rather than less effective. Zektar tried to understand the psychological reaction using Valerian military training. Logical soldiers should become more cautious after witnessing the death of experienced personnel. The smart response was to minimize additional casualties by fighting more carefully. Humans seemed to operate under completely different emotional rules. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez explained the phenomenon while manually targeting weapon systems that should have been controlled by computers. Human military psychology was built around the concept of escalating commitment. When one person sacrificed themselves for victory, every other member of the unit felt obligated to match or exceed that level of dedication. Death became inspiration, rather than discouragement. The second bioship died when Engineer Parker overloaded the Defiance's main power core while the ship was locked in combat range. The explosion vaporized both vessels, but Parker had timed the detonation to create a chain reaction among nearby swarm ships. 3 additional bioships were destroyed in the blast, and 2 more were severely damaged by debris traveling at near light speed. Morrison ordered the surviving crew to abandon ship before the reactor explosion. They transferred to shuttles and escape pods but continued fighting as individual units rather than retreating to safety. Each small craft carried enough weapons to damage bioships and enough explosives to ensure that capture would result in mutual destruction. The humans had turned their evacuation into an extension of the battle. Zektar found himself aboard a shuttle piloted by Lieutenant Commander Rick Hayes. The human had suffered a massive head wound during the reactor explosion and was bleeding profusely from a skull fracture. Medical scanners showed that Hayes had sustained brain damage that should have resulted in immediate unconsciousness. Instead, he continued flying with mechanical precision while laughing at random intervals. Hayes explained that human physiology could function far beyond normal safety limits when survival depended on ignoring injury. Pain was just information, and information could be processed later when immediate threats were eliminated. The human body produced chemical compounds that blocked suffering and enhanced performance during extreme stress. Other species called this phenomenon shock, but humans had learned to control and extend the effect through mental training. The battle continued for 2 hours, with humans attacking bioships using tactics that defied every principle of rational warfare. They rammed shuttles into vital organs of living vessels. They detonated nuclear weapons inside feeding chambers. They used their own life support systems as chemical weapons by releasing atmospheric toxins into bioship breathing apparatus. Most disturbing was how humans adapted their tactics based on swarm responses. When bioships began closing their feeding ports to prevent internal attacks, humans targeted sensory organs instead. When creatures developed armor against nuclear weapons, humans switched to biological agents that caused genetic mutations. Every defensive adaptation triggered a more creative human offensive response. Zektar realized that humans were not simply fighting the Korath swarm. They were studying their enemies and developing new forms of warfare in real time. Each battle was simultaneously a combat engagement and a scientific experiment designed to discover better methods of inflicting suffering. The humans were learning how to kill bioships more effectively with every passing minute. The turning point came when the remaining swarm vessels began to retreat. Zektar had never heard of the Korath swarm withdrawing from any battle in their 1,000-year history. The bioships were genetically programmed to fight until total victory or complete destruction. They did not possess the psychological capacity for strategic retreat, but the creatures were fleeing from human attacks with obvious signs of panic. Their perfect formation had dissolved into chaotic flight patterns. Several bioships collided with each other while attempting to escape. The swarm had encountered something that violated their fundamental understanding of how warfare was supposed to function. Hayes piloted their shuttle in pursuit of fleeing bioships while explaining what had happened. Humans had not defeated the swarm through superior technology or tactical brilliance. They had introduced concepts that bioships could not process using their evolutionary programming. The creatures were designed to fight enemies that wanted to survive. They had no response protocols for enemies that embraced death as a tactical advantage. More importantly, humans had demonstrated that suffering could be weaponized in ways that transcended physical damage. Bioships could adapt to any weapon, but they could not adapt to psychological warfare designed to create existential terror. The swarm had learned that humans were willing to accept any level of personal destruction to ensure enemy defeat. The evacuation of Kepler Station was completed, while the remaining swarm ships continued their retreat toward deep space. 3,000 civilians had been saved because 47 humans had volunteered to die in ways that would traumatize their enemies into abandoning an unwinnable battle. The mathematics of the engagement made no sense according to any conventional military analysis. Admiral Texor contacted the surviving human shuttles to coordinate rescue operations. The Valerian commander seemed stunned by what he had witnessed. His tactical computers could not calculate how such a small force had defeated a vastly superior enemy. The algorithms assumed that rational beings would choose survival over victory. When faced with impossible odds, Morrison responded to the Admiral's confusion with weary patience. He explained that humans had learned a fundamental truth about warfare during their violent evolutionary history. Some battles could only be won by beings willing to pay prices that rational minds considered unacceptable. The key was not eliminating fear, but transforming terror into a weapon that could be used against enemies who still hoped to survive. As rescue ships arrived to collect the human survivors, Zektar tried to process what he had learned about his new allies. The humans had not simply won an impossible battle. They had redefined what victory meant in ways that would change galactic warfare forever. Other species would have to choose between adopting human methods or accepting permanent military inferiority. The medical bay of the Valerian rescue ship was filled with wounded humans who continued discussing battle tactics while receiving treatment for severe injuries. They analyzed their performance with scientific detachment and suggested improvements for future engagements. The conversation focused on developing more effective methods of psychological warfare rather than mourning their dead comrades. Zektar realized that he was experiencing genuine terror for the first time in his military career. Not fear of the Korath swarm or any external enemy, but fear of fighting alongside beings who treated destruction as an art form. Humans had shown that they could defeat any enemy by becoming more frightening than the threats they faced. The alliance between humanity and the Valerian Republic would continue, but the balance of power had shifted in ways that could not be reversed. Humans had proven that they possessed capabilities that transcended conventional military thinking. They had turned warfare itself into something that rational minds could barely comprehend. As the rescue fleet departed for Valerian space, Zektar filed his initial combat report. He recommended that humanity be offered full military alliance status with one critical stipulation. Under no circumstances should the Valerian Republic ever find itself in conflict with human forces. Some allies were too dangerous to risk becoming enemies. The report would change how every civilized species in the galaxy approached relationships with humanity. The humans had announced their presence in galactic politics by demonstrating that they could defeat impossible odds through methods that other beings found morally unacceptable. They had made fear itself into their most effective weapon. The military academy on Valeria Prime had trained officers for 300 years, using proven methods based on logical thinking and mathematical analysis. The War College contained the most advanced tactical computers in the galaxy and maintained detailed records of every significant battle fought by civilized species. Nothing in their databases prepared them for studying human military doctrine. Zektar spent 6 weeks trying to understand how humans had defeated the Korath swarm, using methods that violated every principle of rational warfare. The tactical. Computers could not process human strategy, because the algorithms assumed that survival was the primary objective of any military engagement. Humans operated under completely different assumptions about what victory meant and what prices were acceptable to achieve it. Admiral Texor had assigned Zektar to lead a special research project focused on human combat psychology. The Valerian military needed to understand their new allies before committing to deeper cooperation. The initial findings were disturbing enough that the research was classified at the highest security levels. Some knowledge was too dangerous for general distribution. The first revelation came from studying human historical records. Humans had been fighting wars for thousands of years using methods that would be considered evidence of mass insanity by other species. They developed weapons specifically designed to cause maximum suffering rather than quick death. They created military strategies based on acceptable casualty rates that would horrify any rational being. The concept of total war was particularly troubling to Valerian analysts. Humans had fought conflicts where the complete destruction of enemy civilizations became the only acceptable outcome. They had developed nuclear weapons capable of eliminating all life on a planet and seriously considered using them during several historical conflicts. The capacity for such absolute destruction suggested psychological pathology on a species-wide scale. But the historical records also showed that human civilization had survived these conflicts and emerged stronger after each war. The species had learned to channel their destructive instincts into tools for defending themselves and their allies. They had transformed their capacity for violence into a form of deterrent that prevented larger conflicts through the threat of unacceptable retaliation. Corporal Danny Wright arrived on Valeria Prime as part of a human military exchange program designed to improve cooperation between allied forces. Wright was assigned to train Valerian special forces in human combat techniques. The lessons revealed fundamental differences in how the two species approached physical conflict. Valerian combat training focused on efficiency and quick victory through superior tactics and technology. Soldiers were taught to minimize casualties and preserve resources for future battles. The goal was to defeat enemies while maintaining the capacity to fight additional conflicts if necessary. Logical thinking and careful planning were considered the most important military virtues. Human combat training assumed that everything would go wrong at the worst possible moment. Wright taught Valerian recruits to fight while severely injured, exhausted, and psychologically compromised. He demonstrated techniques for continuing battle after losing weapons, communications, and medical support. The training scenarios assumed that normal military doctrine would fail, and soldiers would need to improvise solutions using whatever resources remained available. The most disturbing lesson involved what humans called interrogation resistance. Wright allowed himself to be subjected to pain that should have caused immediate surrender, while continuing to provide false information with convincing sincerity. He explained that humans had learned to compartmentalize suffering by treating torture as just another tactical problem that could be solved through mental discipline. Zektar observed this demonstration with growing horror. Wright endured electrical shock, chemical burns, and psychological pressure for 3 hours without revealing any genuine intelligence. Instead, he provided false data that sounded believable, but would lead enemies into carefully prepared traps. The human had turned his own torture into a weapon against his captors. When Zektar asked how such resistance was possible, Wright explained that human psychology could separate the experience of pain from the emotional response to suffering. Physical damage was just information that could be processed later, when immediate survival was no longer threatened. The key was accepting that torture was inevitable in military careers and preparing for it through mental training. The training exercise revealed that humans possessed capabilities that other species would consider supernatural. They could function effectively while enduring levels of physical and psychological damage that would incapacitate any rational being. More importantly, they could weaponize their own suffering by using torture sessions to mislead enemies and gather intelligence about interrogation methods. Joint military exercises between human and Valerian forces provided additional insights into human tactical thinking. Humans approached each battle scenario by assuming that their initial plan would fail and preparing multiple backup strategies. They trained their personnel to recognize when normal doctrine was inadequate and switch to improvised solutions without waiting for orders from command. The concept of acceptable losses was particularly difficult for Valerian officers to understand. Humans calculated casualty rates that would be considered evidence of command incompetence by other species. They planned military operations where 50% casualties were considered reasonable if the mission succeeded. The mathematics of human warfare assumed that some objectives were worth any price. But humans also demonstrated tactical flexibility that exceeded anything in Valerian military experience. When their planned strategies failed, they adapted with creativity that bordered on genius. They used enemy weapons against their original owners. They turned environmental hazards into tactical advantages. They transformed defeats into victories by changing the definition of what victory meant. The most unsettling discovery came from studying human soldiers who had returned from combat against the Korath swarm. These veterans displayed psychological symptoms that would be considered evidence of severe mental illness by Valerian medical standards. They suffered from recurring nightmares, emotional numbness, and aggressive behavior that made them unsuitable for normal civilian life. Yet these damaged soldiers were often the most effective fighters when returned to combat duty. Their psychological wounds had somehow enhanced their capacity for violence, rather than reducing their military effectiveness. They approached battle with a combination of technical skill and controlled insanity that made them nearly unstoppable in individual combat situations. Wright explained that humans called this condition battle fatigue, but they had learned to manage it rather than cure it. Combat veterans were valuable resources that required careful handling, but could not be simply discarded when they became psychologically unsuitable for peaceful society. The military had developed programs for channeling their enhanced aggression into constructive applications. The research project concluded with a series of classified recommendations that would shape Valerian policy toward humanity for generations. The alliance should continue, but with strict limitations on human military involvement in conflicts that did not threaten core Valerian interests. Humans were too dangerous to use as routine allies, but too valuable to alienate through casual disagreements. More importantly, the research suggested that other galactic civilizations would need to choose between adopting human military methods or accepting permanent inferiority in any future conflicts. Humans had demonstrated that conventional warfare could be defeated by species willing to embrace levels of destruction that rational minds considered unacceptable. Zektar filed his final report with deep personal reservations about its implications. The alliance with humanity offered tremendous strategic advantages, but it also threatened to corrupt Valerian civilization through exposure to human methods of thinking about conflict. Some forms of knowledge were too dangerous for species that valued logical thinking and peaceful coexistence. The report recommended that Valerian military personnel assigned to work with humans should receive psychological screening before and after their tours of duty. Extended exposure to human tactical thinking could cause permanent changes in how individuals understood the relationship between violence and survival. These changes might be irreversible and could spread through the military hierarchy, if not carefully controlled. Wright completed his training assignment and returned to human space carrying detailed intelligence about Valerian military capabilities and psychology. Zektar realized that the exchange program had been as much about human intelligence gathering as it was about improving cooperation between allies. The humans were studying their friends as carefully as they studied their enemies. As the research project ended, Zektar understood that humanity had introduced concepts into galactic warfare that could not be contained or controlled through normal diplomatic channels. They had demonstrated that some species were willing to pay prices for victory, that others would consider evidence of collective insanity. The implications would reshape military thinking throughout civilized space. 8 months after the Battle of Kepler Station, Zektar stood on the observation deck of the Combined Fleet flagship, watching human engineers install weapons that violated 3 different galactic treaties. The devices were designed to cause biological weapons to turn living ships against themselves in ways that created maximum psychological trauma for any survivors. The humans called them mercy weapons because they ended conflicts quickly through overwhelming horror. Captain Morrison had recovered from his injuries and now commanded a joint task force of human vessels supported by Valerian tactical coordination. The alliance had proven devastatingly effective against the remaining Korath swarm strongholds. Every engagement resulted in complete human victory with casualty rates that would have been considered acceptable by both species under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances, and the victories came with prices that Zektar was only beginning to understand. The human crew showed signs of psychological damage that accumulated with each successful battle. They displayed what human medical officers called combat fatigue, but Zektar recognized as evidence of minds that had been exposed to too much controlled insanity. The most disturbing aspect was how these damaged soldiers became more effective fighters as their psychological condition deteriorated. Morrison himself was no longer entirely sane by any rational definition, yet his tactical brilliance had increased rather than decreased. He made strategic decisions that defied computer analysis, but consistently resulted in overwhelming victory against impossible odds. Lieutenant Commander Hayes had returned to active duty despite brain damage that should have ended his military career. The injury had somehow enhanced his capacity for creative violence while eliminating normal emotional responses to suffering. He approached each battle with mechanical precision and obvious enjoyment that made even veteran human soldiers uncomfortable. The Joint Fleet had developed biological weapons specifically designed to exploit the genetic vulnerabilities of Korath bioships. The viruses caused living vessels to develop cancerous growths that consume the creatures from within, while keeping them alive long enough to spread the infection to other swarm ships. The weapons were elegant in their efficiency and absolutely horrifying in their implementation. Zektar watched the final battle against the Korath swarm with a mixture of professional fascination and personal revulsion. The engagement lasted less than 2 hours, but the dying continued for days afterward. The bioships writhed in space as they devoured themselves while broadcasting distress signals that sounded like screams of agony from creatures that had never experienced pain before. The humans observed this destruction with calm satisfaction, while recording detailed measurements of how long each bioship took to die. They analyzed the efficiency of different viral strains and made notes about improving the weapons for use against other living ships. The systematic approach to biological warfare suggested that humans had been planning these methods for months, rather than developing them in response to immediate tactical needs. Morrison explained the strategic logic during a briefing with Valerian command staff. The goal was not simply to defeat the Korath swarm, but to ensure that no other species would ever consider using bioships as weapons of war. The viral weapons were designed to create genetic patterns that would spread through any living vessel, technology, and destroy it before it could be used effectively in combat. More importantly, the weapons demonstrated human capacity for developing forms of destruction that transcended conventional understanding of warfare. Any species that witnessed bioships dying from human viruses would understand that humans possessed capabilities that could not be defended against using normal military doctrine. The psychological impact was more valuable than the tactical victory. The final swarm stronghold surrendered without fighting when human bioweapons reached their system. The creatures had learned that resistance would result in extended agony, while surrender offered quick death. They chose extinction over the possibility of experiencing what humans had done to their fellow ships. The war ended not with a battle, but with suicide by an entire species. Zektar filed his combat reports with growing concern about what he had witnessed during the campaign. The alliance with humanity had achieved every strategic objective, but the methods used to secure victory threatened to corrupt Valerian civilization through prolonged exposure to human thinking about warfare. Some prices were too high even for complete military success. The human crews celebrated their victory with rituals that revealed more disturbing aspects of their psychology. They honored their dead comrades by promising to inflict similar destruction on future enemies. They treated the extinction of the Korath swarm as the beginning of a new phase in galactic warfare, rather than the end of a specific conflict. Most troubling was how the humans had begun to analyze other galactic species as potential threats that might require similar treatment. They studied the military capabilities of every civilization they encountered, and developed theoretical weapons designed to exploit specific biological and psychological vulnerabilities. The alliance with Valeria had become a platform for intelligence, gathering about potential future enemies. Morrison invited Zektar to join the planning staff for human expansion into formerly swarm-controlled territory. The invitation was simultaneously an honor and a test of Valerian loyalty to the alliance. Morrison wanted to know if other species could learn to think like humans, when strategic necessity demanded abandoning conventional morality. The planning sessions revealed that humans had been developing long-term strategies for establishing military dominance throughout the galaxy. They had identified potential threats among every major civilization and created detailed plans for neutralizing those threats through psychological warfare, biological weapons, and controlled application of the tactics that had destroyed the Korath swarm. Zektar realized that the war against the swarm had been simultaneously a conflict against a specific enemy and a training exercise for future campaigns against more challenging opponents. Humans had used the bioships as test subjects for developing weapons and tactics that could be adapted for use against any species that threatened human interests. The implications were staggering because they suggested that humanity viewed the galaxy as a collection of potential enemies that would eventually need to be controlled or eliminated. The alliance with Valeria was based on temporary mutual interest, rather than genuine friendship between species that shared compatible values about warfare and civilization. During the final briefing before returning to Valerian space, Morrison asked Zektar if he had learned what he came to understand about human military capabilities. The question was phrased casually, but carried implications that made Zektar choose his words carefully. The humans wanted to know if their allies had become comfortable with human methods, or if the alliance would require constant management to prevent betrayal. Zektar replied that he had learned to respect human effectiveness while maintaining appropriate concern about the methods used to achieve victory. The diplomatic answer satisfied Morrison, but also confirmed that Valeria would never fully embrace human approaches to warfare. The alliance would continue, but with carefully maintained boundaries that prevented complete integration between the two military systems. As the joint fleet prepared to return to normal patrol duties, Zektar understood that he had witnessed something that would change galactic civilization forever. Humans had not simply won a war against the Korath swarm. They had demonstrated capabilities that forced every other species to recalculate their assumptions about what was possible in military conflict. The knowledge was simultaneously valuable and dangerous because it revealed that some species were willing to pay prices for security, that others would consider evidence of collective madness. Humans had shown that they could defeat any enemy by becoming more terrifying than the threats they faced. The final report that Zektar submitted to Valerian Command contained recommendations that would shape policy toward humanity for generations. The alliance should continue, but with strict limitations on human involvement in conflicts that did not directly threaten Valerian interests. Humans were too valuable as allies and too dangerous as potential enemies to risk through casual disagreements about military ethics. More importantly, the report recommended that Valeria should never find itself in conflict with human forces under any circumstances. The species that could destroy the Korath swarm through psychological warfare and biological weapons possessed capabilities that could not be defeated using conventional military doctrine. Some enemies were too dangerous to fight even if victory was theoretically possible. Looking back at his months of service alongside human forces, Zektar understood that he had learned the true meaning of fear. Not fear of death or physical destruction, but fear of fighting beside beings who treated warfare as an art form that transcended conventional understanding of violence. Humans had made fear itself into their most effective weapon. The alliance between humanity and the Valerian Republic would endure, but the balance of power had shifted in ways that could never be reversed.